Welcome to the Vaughn Hanshaw broadcast. This is your evangelist, Brother Vaughn Hanshaw. On today's program, I want to discuss the very important topic of how to study the Bible in its proper context. It is imperative and critically important to study Bible passages within their context. Taking verses out of context leads to error, misunderstanding, misnomers, confusion, and false teaching. Cults are formed many times, and if not most of the times, when their gurus and their spiritual leaders and their false teachers take verses of Scripture out of the Holy Bible out of context. A passage or a verse taken out of context becomes a pretext. A pretext is a misleading, misguided, and wrong interpretation of a verse or a passage of Scripture in the Bible. A pretext may sound right to a biblically illiterate person, but all Scripture must be read in its proper context. Here are some basic and very elementary things to consider when reading the Bible. Number one, never just read a single verse of Scripture and expect to arrive at its accurate contextual meaning. Number two, the Bible is broken down into different types of writing and literature. Now, this is very important to understand. The Bible contains many types of literature: narrative, poetic, prophetic, instructional, and figurative. Number three, understanding context includes looking at the literal meaning, what it says in the original Hebrew and Greek languages, looking at the historical setting, the events of the story, to whom it was addressed, and how it was understood at that particular time in history. And then we have to understand the grammar, the immediate sentence and the paragraph within which a word or phrase is found. We have to understand basic English grammar to understand Greek and Hebrew grammar. And synthesis, comparing it with other Scripture in the Bible for a fuller meaning. That is synthesis. Number four, determine the theme, the focus, the purpose of the book of the Bible, the verse or the passage that it's in. Number five, once you determine the purpose of the book of that Bible you're studying, then you have to determine the theme of that chapter or chapters, and then determine the theme of the paragraphs in the chapter. This all has to do with determining the right, proper, accurate, biblically context that the passage or verse you're studying is in. For example, context is like looking at a Google map and zooming in on one house. That's context. Most preachers preach and teach like a shotgun. They just let it blast, and they chase rabbits down one trail and down another trail, and by the time they try to make their main points, you're lost and you're confused. That's not what it means to study the Bible in context. Listen, let me give you a good example of a verse of Scripture that charismatics and some Pentecostals, but mostly charismatics, use, and they take it out of context. Those that teach the health and wealth gospel use this verse, and they take it completely out of context. Go to the tiny book of 3 John, verse 2, and it says this: Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as your soul prospers. In order to arrive at the true meaning of this little verse, we have to go back to verse 1, which says this: The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Who is the elder? That is the Apostle John. John is the one writing this book. So we see that John is speaking to his dear friend Gaius. This is not God speaking to every Christian, as the Word of Faith teachers say. In context, if you will go into some Jewish history, manners and customs books, you will quickly discover that this was a very common greeting among friends in that era, in that time. For example, if I had a friend named James Smith, and if I were to write James Smith a letter and begin by saying something like this: I hope all is well with you, James Smith, physically and spiritually. That is all the Apostle John is saying here to his good friend Gaius. 4 times in this short letter, the verbal adjective beloved is used of Gaius. The Greek word for prosper here is se euduostai, means to have a good journey, to be doing well. Every word of faith, charismatic, prosperity, false teacher takes this little verse out of its context and creates a pretext. They use eisegesis instead of exegesis. Eisegesis is when someone puts their own interpretation on a scripture rather than the biblical interpretation. Exegesis is when a person keeps the verse or passage in its proper context and uses the biblical interpretation. This is good hermeneutics, and hermeneutics means interpretation. You cannot arrive at a good biblical interpretation when you take a verse out of context. You cannot do it. Now listen, it may take some time finding the context, at times depending on what part of the Bible you're studying, but you have to do this in order to keep the Bible in its proper interpretation. I see that I'm out of time. I pray this little Bible study's helped you. Until next time, may God richly bless you is my sincere prayer.